Y ahora en esta ocasión, en esta mesa que hemos preparado, vamos a charlar y a debatir y a compartir entre todas bueno, las diferentes experiencias, ¿no? También que han ido surgiendo a nivel europeo en torno al boicot académico, ¿no? Y diferentes grupos, comités de apoyo de solidaridad con el pueblo palestino, ¿no?
Bueno, buenas tardes, gracias a todos por estar aquí. A ver, yo brevemente describiré un poco las experiencias que tenemos desde Cataluña con el boicot académico y cómo sale la CUNCAP, que como ha dicho Eneco es Comissió Universitària Catalana per Palestina. El origen está en diciembre del 2008, coincidiendo con los bombardeos a Gaza, la operación Plomo Fundido. Paralelamente a toda la masacre, el gobierno catalán de Convergencia y Unió estaba la Consejería de Innovación y Universidades estableciendo nuevos acuerdos con Israel. Nos parecía una cosa totalmente descabellada y empezamos a mover, os digo, paralelamente a todo el resto de iniciativas que se llevaron en ese momento, lo que es la firma de un manifiesto en contra de estos acuerdos por parte de personal académico. En un tiempo muy corto conseguimos más de 350 firmas de profesores, investigadores y personal de Administración y Servicios de la Universidad y las presentamos en la consejería, ante el consejero de Innovación y Universidades, y fueron 3 personas en representación, que conseguimos que fueran un historiador, bueno, ahora ya fallecido, pero muy conocido y además universitario, que es Josep Fontana, un rector de la Universidad Politécnica de Cataluña, Pep Ferrer, y un activista experto en Derecho, que es José Gordillo. Bueno, esto nos animó a que eso no quedara ahí y constituirnos como grupo y seguir trabajando el boicot académico. Y, bueno, y eso hicimos, la idea es promocionar todo lo que es boicot académico en las universidades catalanas. Y hemos ido haciendo diferentes acciones. Por un lado, tuvimos también la oportunidad, también es verdad que aprovechando que en Cataluña, en Barcelona, ya existían movimientos muy fuertes como la Xarxa d'Enllaç en Palestina, la agrupación de entidades Palestina al COR, de activismo con Palestina. Se organizó también una de las sesiones del Tribunal Russell. Todo eso también ayudó a que tuviéramos más relación con grupos internacionales y pudimos asistir a la formación de PACBI, la plataforma europea de BDS académico en 2010 en París, si no recuerdo mal. Bueno, también hemos organizado diferentes charlas en este estilo, más pequeñas o de mayor o menor formato, y quizás una que para nosotros marcó un punto de inflexión quizás fue una organizada ya por título de Educación, un derecho vulnerado en Palestina, en la que tuvimos la oportunidad de contar, bueno, entre otros con Hickley, Haidareit, esto era en 2010 creo, entonces Haidareit no pudo asistir, pero lo tuvimos en videoconferencia, Agustín Belloso, Héctor Grat, diferentes figuras tanto internacionales como del ámbito nacional. Y a nivel nacional nos ayudó mucho a conocer otros grupos, otras realidades, otras personas trabajando en este tema. Y un poco a raíz de entonces empezamos a estar más en contacto y surgió la iniciativa de formar una plataforma a nivel estatal que trabajara por el boicot académico, y también existe ahora, bueno, es básicamente un grupo que funciona a nivel de Internet, de correo electrónico, que es la PBAI, la Plataforma para el Boicot Académico a Israel, que aglutina un poco a todos los académicos, activistas del Estado. Y bueno, estamos en un punto en el que sería ideal que fuéramos más activos. Es complicado llevar un nivel de actividad alto en las universidades y demás, pero sí que lo que tenemos, tanto a nivel local como más con el grupo PEBAI, es una plataforma que nos permite una reacción rápida, sobre todo ante actos, eventos, enviar cartas, enviar protestas. En este sentido, creo que sí que existe una buena coordinación y una capacidad de reacción. Por otro lado, sí que pienso que una de las debilidades del movimiento a nivel académico, y sobre todo pensando ya más en clave de la CUNCAP, es no haber conectado, en nuestro caso, con sindicatos, ni de profesorado, ni tampoco de una manera constante con estudiantes, ya sea sindicatos de estudiantes o agrupaciones de estudiantes. Hay movimientos, contactos puntuales, colaboración puntual, grupos que surgen muchas veces pues, después de a lo mejor un viaje a Palestina y tienen interés y demás, pero no hemos conseguido tener un trabajo continuo con los estudiantes, que yo creo que también es un trabajo de base que permite desarrollar muchas actividades. Nos permitiría a lo mejor tener más presencia durante la Israeli Apartheid Week y demás. Entonces, creo que eso sí que son debilidades que hay que poner sobre la mesa y un poco intentar ver si conseguimos experiencias para mejorar. Cosas que sí se han hecho y que se sigue trabajando en ello, una campaña conjunta con otras organizaciones internacionales en lo que es la oposición a los acuerdos Unión Europea-Israel, en general y sobre todo en el sentido de los programas, el programa marco europeo de investigación y que próximamente será el Horizon 2020. Se mandaron cartas a los eurodiputados pidiendo la oposición y creo que esto es un objetivo que debe seguir sobre la mesa. Se consiguió también que entrara la Universidad Politécnica a formar parte del Peace Program de la UNESCO, que es un programa que tiene como idea la solidaridad entre universidades europeas y palestinas, y se organizó la 7ª asamblea del Peace Program en la Universidad Politécnica, con presencia tanto de universidades españolas como de las autoridades de diversas universidades palestinas. De todos modos, creo que también, otra vez, una de cal y una de arena, no se ha conseguido pasar del marco institucional. Muchas veces tienes así en ese momento las autoridades, pero luego concretar acuerdos, concretar acciones no es sencillo y también creo que quizás sería más interesante tener trabajo más de base. Hemos hecho alguna charla en algunas clases de cooperación de la universidad y creo que esa es una vía que habría que potenciar, ya que existe posibilidad de enviar estudiantes de nuestras universidades, por ejemplo en el caso de la mía, que es muy técnica, a diversos puntos de Palestina para que hagan, por ejemplo, el proyecto final de carrera, vivan esa experiencia y la transmitan a su universidad. Esto también no es propiamente BDS, pero es una vía de introducir todo lo que es Palestina en la universidad. Desde la PEBAI se han conseguido más de 500 firmas que apoyan el manifiesto, o una versión en castellano más o menos del manifiesto de BDS, que eso es muy bien, admirable, qué bien, pero sin embargo, otra vez un poco nos hemos quedado en recoger esas firmas y no se les ha dado la suficiente visibilidad. Nos falta un poco, creo, un objetivo claro, un objetivo que no nos disperse y por el cual podamos aunar fuerzas para conseguir eso y creo que eso es un tema que es importante debatir, es importante trabajar, porque si no es muy fácil, y más en el momento en el que estamos ahora, con tantas luchas también a nivel interno de la universidad, de políticas, de toda la sociedad, pero además en la universidad también está siendo muy fuerte el ataque a la universidad que estamos viviendo. Es fácil que Palestina quede relegado. Entonces creo que es importante conseguir objetivos claros, y poder aunar eso, sumar fuerzas para trabajar en eso. Y bueno, yo creo que básicamente es esto. Bueno, estamos ahí, pero creo que nos hace falta más fuerza para que no decaiga el movimiento. Y yo lo dejaría ahora de momento aquí, ya luego se abre el debate.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Tom Hickley, as I've already been introduced. I'm a member of the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine, and I'm also a National Executive Committee member of the University and Colleges Union in the UK. I wanted to start by making a few general remarks. I know that this afternoon's session is primarily directed to issues of strategy and tactics, but I'm strongly of the view that it's very difficult to have a meaningful discussion about strategy and tactics unless one has already secured the political vision that's driving one forward to have those strategies in the first instance. And of course, it's not just a question of linking a political vision with strategy and tactics. It's also a question of passion, of the emotional reaction that we have to the events that we see around us. Because without that passion, there isn't actually the volition that will make us do anything. And you don't have to be a follower of Friedrich Nietzsche in order to see the power of such a claim. And I think that as soon as we do start talking about a vision, and indeed the motivations that we have for this interest that we have in Palestine, that is, I think, I don't think it would be something that would be questioned by anyone, a motivation that's founded on a mixture of concern for justice on the one hand and equality on the other. Those seem to me to be the driving motivations. In other words, a vision of a society of equal citizenship. And I think that that idea of a vision of a society of equal citizenship is something that we need as a vision to keep firmly in mind if we are to make sense about the question, what strategy would be best pursued in order to secure the liberation or to help Palestinians secure their liberation. And I think that that, for instance, is the reason why the discussion that we were having at the end of the last session was such an important discussion. An important discussion that I don't think that we've yet completed, and I hope that we have an opportunity in the question and answer sessions in this session to carry it forward. I'm particularly keen that we should do that because I thought that there was a really provocative and very interesting basis for an argument and a debate made by Augustin. Augustin gave us an argument which he said right at the start. He was going to not be politically correct. He was going to wear his passion on his sleeve, to use the English phrase. And I think he certainly did that. Because what he was arguing was, on the one hand, we might be committed to BDS as a strategy, but we also needed to see the moral element here. And he was concerned that those who have practiced barbarities against the Palestinians should be paid back. There's a punishment that was due. The violence that had been inflicted could not be a violence that simply was ignored or simply put aside. And as part of that argument, what he suggested to us was that in that sense, boycott, disinvestment and sanctions was, in one sense at least, the smallest or the least response that one might have to it. And that's really what I want to take issue with. Because I don't think that that's right. And I might be wrong, and that's why I think it's worth having a discussion about. Because I think that boycott, disinvestment and sanctions, the BDS movement, isn't the least response that we could have to the barbarities that we've seen Israel practice against the Palestinians. I think in an important sense, it is the most of the responses. And the reason why I think it is the most of the responses, it is the greatest response, it is the most important response that we could have, is this. You see, I think that there is a strategic underestimation of what BDS represents when it is put like that. The politics of this situation are such that what BDS represents, in my view, as somebody who has studied the situation in the Middle East for some considerable time, is not simply a supplement to the various forms of solidarity action with the Palestinians that have been practiced over decades. It's not a supplement to it. It's not even the most important of a set of alternative solidarity actions. It's much more than that. It is, in fact, a strategic alternative to anything that has been attempted before. You see, BDS constitutes a break, in my view, with two key elements that have characterized the Palestinian resistance to the occupation and to their deprivation of them from their land, the break of them from their land. A break with two things. The first thing that it's a break with is the notion of a heroic military victory, whether carried through in the facile imaginations of those who thought that Arab states were somehow going to rush to the aid of Palestinians, or indeed at the hands of heroic groups of Fedayeen. So it's a break with that. Secondly, it's a break with the illusion that in some way there is a negotiated way forward, that at the behest of this president or that president of the United States, that Israel will sit down with the Palestinians and negotiate a settlement. I mean, if anybody has any doubts about the facile nature of such an idea, one might just consider the sequence of such behests that various successive presidents have made, as Tweedledum is only trumped by Tweedledee to set up another empty process that gets nowhere. And of course, a peace process that has been advanced in those terms, a negotiated settlement that has in effect been ruled out as a possibility by the actions of Israel itself. As Haider has mentioned at least twice in the last 2 days in talks that he's given that I've heard, one needs to register that over the last 18 years, the number of illegal settlers in the West Bank has increased from something like 140,000 to something only just short of 650,000. What that in effect means that the Israeli state policy of settlement has ruled out the possibility of a negotiated solution with two independent states side by side. So what BDS represents is something that is a break with a military solution on the one hand and with a negotiated settlement on the other. And what it claims is that those of us who live outside the area, sometimes euphemistically called the international community, have to put our monies where our mouths are. If we are committed to human rights, if we are committed to equality, if we believe in the sanctity of law, that citizens of the world should abide by international law, then international law must be followed. And what the BDS movement claims is this, as again Haider has made clear, as the call from Hickley and the Boicot National Committee have made clear, their claims are claims that those in the area should be subject to the laws in exactly the same way, whether they are currently Israeli citizens, Israeli Jews or Palestinians, or whether they are Palestinians in the occupied territories, or the 7 million Palestinians who are also part of the Palestinian nature, who live outside in the Palestinian diaspora. In other words, they have to be treated with equality. They have to have the right to return to their homes. They have to have the right not to live under an illegal occupation. Now, what that represents is a strategic break. It's not about the rhetoric of destroying Israel. It's not about the rhetoric of a name. It's about not just a rhetoric, but a movement that attempts to put into reality, to concretize in reality, what international law is said to bequeath to us all. And in that sense, therefore, I think it is the most, not the least. And the smallest thing that we do to enhance BDS is the greatest thing we can do. Hanging posters of past heroes on our bedroom walls is nothing in comparison to simply convincing somebody that if they believe in human rights, if they have a belief in justice and democracy, not empty peace, not peace without justice, but if they believe in peace with justice, then the smallest thing that they can do for BDS is what they must do. And in that sense, I don't think this is really a question of moral outrage. There's nothing wrong with moral outrage. I get morally outraged by many things. But moral outrage that doesn't have attached to it a cold, analytical gaze as to what that moral outrage should lead to strategically and tactically is, I suggest to you, an indulgence. To be morally outraged and not to work out how to act on the basis of the outrage is simply to indulge oneself with a feeling that at least I know what is good or bad. I apologize to you, comrades and friends, that I have nothing wrong with you feeling good or bad, but actually my respect for you will depend on whether your knowledge of the good and the bad turns into an action that can support the good and repress the bad. So I think that that kind of political vision has to lie at the heart of what we do. And it has to lie at the heart of what we do, not just because I suggest that it needs to, but because practically to convince, first of all, 100 people, then 1,000 people, then 10,000 people, and then people in their hundreds of thousands across Europe, in North America, in South America, in South Asia, requires us to be able to explain this, to respond to the challenges that will be thrown at us, and they will be. And the importance of it at the moment, I don't think, can be underestimated, because the BDS movement has gone from an idea, some 10, 12 years in existence, more or less, now into reality. 3 really important things. I won't even speak about the decision of my trade union, which represents all of the university lecturers and college lecturers in England, Scotland and Wales, and about half of the university lecturers in Scotland. We have about 120,000 members across the UK. I won't even speak about that. But 3 much more important things. The first is the decision by a colleague of mine, Professor Stephen Hawking, not to go to Jerusalem. Because that, you cannot underestimate the significance of that. It's impossible to overestimate the significance. You must not underestimate it, and it's impossible to overestimate it. Because this strikes at the very heart of Israel's rebranding exercise, not just as the society of democracy, but as the society of research in these areas, particularly in the area of the natural sciences and in engineering and scientific applications. Strikes at the very heart of it. So strong a strike at it that one sympathizer of the Palestinians who has for long, decades, closed off the possibility of accepting the necessity of boycott, disinvestment and sanctions since it existed, for the last 10, 15 years. Even Noam Chomsky has been moved by the fact that Hawkins has done this. Chomsky's changed his mind. Not completely, we'll have another 5 years of arguing with him, but I think in the end we will change his mind. It's changed everything. It has changed everything. Secondly is the decision by the Teachers' Union of Ireland, which represents all the university lecturers in the country that is my country of origin. I'm not actually English or British, to go for an academic boycott. And then there's the decision of the US Asian Studies Association of the United States to do the same thing. I will mention one thing that has also changed the game plan somewhat, and that is a recent legal decision in Britain that affects my union, that has been, I think, not just of national, but of international significance. And that's the decision of a British court to reject out of hand and to condemn a legal case brought against our union by one of our own members who accused the union of institutional racism, institutional anti-Semitism, because of our persistent return to the question of Israel and its barbarous acts and the question of Zionism. And that claim against the union was founded on the claim, the philosophical claim, that actually in British law, which has a law called equalities legislation, that anyone who has a characteristic that is systematically disparaged, even if you're disparaging the characteristic rather than the person, is guilty of racism. That's enshrined now in British law for the past 5 years. And this claim by one of our members in the union was that the union, by attacking Zionism and Israel, by criticizing them, Zionism as the ideology and Israel as the fact of the ideology, that we were in effect being anti-Semitic towards our Jewish members. And the court came up with a judgment that was devastating. It condemned the action as an outrageous attempt to achieve a political end through litigious means, wasting the money, God knows how much money it was, of the taxpayer that have to pay for the trial, and wasting the union's money in having to defend the case. And most importantly, completely dismissed the idea that any characteristic of being Jewish could be associated with the political support either for Zionist ideology or for the State of Israel. Now, I think that will have ramifications not just in the UK, it will have ramifications across the world. Most importantly, it will have an effect in the United States of America, and then secondly, in Germany and France, the two countries in which that rhetoric is most heavily used against those concerned about what's being done to the Palestinians. Now, that might sound like the end of my talk. It's actually the end of the beginning of my talk, but I promise you the rest of it isn't going to take that long. Because I want to, on that basis, simply say 2 or 3 things about what that really does come to the question of strategy and tactics for those who are interested in BDS. And I don't do that thinking in some kind of Anglophone, Northern European way I can parachute into Bilbao and give you the lessons of what needs to be done, as I tried not to do a couple of years back in Catalonia in the meeting there. But merely to share some experiences and to see how they work for you. Not least, it's not possible for me from the UK to come and give any kind of direct comparison between Britain and Spain. British trade unions are very different animals from Spanish trade unions. I mean, in Britain, trade unions they're either general unions that represent everybody in all kinds of industries, or as in my union, they represent a specific industry. And they're not divided along political lines as they are in Spain. In England, the political divisions are within the trade unions. So there is no simple, direct comparison. But I think some of the things that we did that enabled us to achieve support in this trade union for BDS were important and might have some value for you here in Euskadi and more widely in Spain. And just as an aside, I would say, I would urge you, not because of any kind of parochial interest I have in it as a British trade unionist, but just as an argument, that the trade unions are very important, whether they're like British unions or they're like Spanish unions or unions in the Basque Country. Their importance lies not in the fact that there's something special about somebody being a trade unionist. It is about the permanence of the organization. It is the fact that it is there, year in, year out, from one decade to another, and as long as there is a division between labour and capital in the world, these defensive organizations will not go away. That means if you want to win a political argument that has persistence and longevity, it has to be won in something like a trade union or a political party, something that lasts beyond the fashion of a particular generation or a particular year. What we did in our union was first of all recognize that as an academic trade union representing university and college lecturers, the issue of the academic boycott was a highly poignant issue, a very sensitive issue. A sensitive issue because I think contrary to what I heard somebody say in one of this morning's session, I do believe that the academic boycott is an infringement of academic freedom. I think it is an infringement of academic freedom. How could it not be? It's an attempt to close down inter-institutional contacts between academics who work for different institutions. Not between the individuals, but between the institutions. And if it's an infringement of academic freedom, even in just that sense, it cuts to the heart of what every academic primarily is concerned to defend. That's the freedom to research and to propagate the knowledge that they discover without let or hindrance from government or anybody else. So why would, and indeed why did, our union decide to infringe one of our prime principles? Well, the answer is quite simple. It took us 4 years to decide it. We debated it at our annual congresses every year for 4 solid years. And each motion that was passed simply said, we need to debate this issue more and take it to the branches, take it back to the campuses of the universities and debate it again and again. And we debated it for 4 years. And then, and only then, brought a motion to our Congress proposing support for the boycott. And we won it devastatingly well as a result of 4 years of preparation. The vote was so overwhelming, nobody counted it. But I think even our adversaries would admit that it was either 80 or 85% of the delegates voted in favor of it. That did not mean, of course, that 80 or 85% of the membership of our union supported it. That still only meant that that decision then had to be taken out and debated again in our branches. I think the second thing to recognize is that even when you win that in a trade union can't instruct its members to boycott Israel. That's not within the domain of power that a union exercises. You can't tell your members, you will not. Because what would a member say to you if you said, you will not have contact with Israeli institutions? You will boycott them. The member will say, well, actually I choose not to, so I resign from the union rather than resign my contact. All that a union can do by taking that position is in effect put it to each of its members that each member should reflect on her or his moral conscience and their political assessment of the world as to whether it is or is not appropriate for them to continue such contacts. That's all that a trade union can do. But in saying that that's all that a trade union can do, that's quite a lot. Because each person who gets posed with that question, even if they haven't reflected on it before, even if they have never had any contact with Israel before, is now being invited by their trade union either to reflect on something that they are doing that the delegates to their union congress think they should not be doing, or thinking about the issue of Israel and Palestine for the first time if they haven't thought about it before. The last thing I would say, I think, is this, that you will, and I'm sure you have already, but certainly if you engage in these debates in the various different political parties in Spain, or the different trade unions that are in one way or another associated with or related to those political parties, face the charge of anti-Semitism. This has to be faced down as what the French call a canard, a lie, a misrepresentation, a self-serving calumny. Choose whichever epithet you like to describe it. Most of the people who are active, certainly in my country, and I'm sure it's here, in the boycott, disinvestment and sanctions movement, came into politics to fight racism and to fight discrimination. In my case, the paradox is, about 4 or 5 years ago, I became the Zionist favorite international symbol of anti-Semitism for pushing these motions at my Congress. Actually, I came into into politics over reading about Nazism and reading about the Holocaust, what is called in the literature the Holocaust, which I prefer to describe as the Judaicide, using a non-biblical term to describe it. That's how I came into politics. So we have to face that down, that argument about anti-Semitism. And I said that it would be the last thing, but I think that it is important that while we might have different positions on the question of whether a one-state or a two-state solution constitutes the future, and I have a view on this, and you've probably picked it up from my introductory remarks, I think it's really important that we should not foreclose on BDS by in any way making support for a BDS strategy, the boycott, disinvestment and sanctions strategy, conditional on somebody supporting one position or another. Indeed, as part of a solidarity movement, there is a sense in which it's not our business. It is my business actually to have a view, and I'll make sure that Haider knows what it is, whether he likes it or not. I certainly have the view, and I'm prepared to propagate it and publicize it and make rhetoric around it, but not to the extent of dictating to the Israelis or the Palestinians how they should sort the problem out, because it is, and notice, it's a problem that the Palestinians have to sort by winning in this strategy, but they're not going to win in this strategy unless they win it in talking to the other of the Palestinians, which over the last 65 years has become the Israelis. They will sort this problem, not us. But without us, as with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, without the external pressure, without the Israeli state and the Israeli people coming to the realization, as the minority white population in South Africa came to the realization, that the world is not with them, that in the end the banks are not with them, and ultimately that the imperial interests of the United States in the Middle East, those interests are no longer with Israel. Without that happening, then it will be that much more difficult for the Palestinians to win and to have the dialogue with Israelis that conditions a future of peace with justice. Thank you.
So, of course, I come here today to the Basque country, and I thank the organisers again for the invite on behalf of myself and the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign that I represent. Scotland, of course, and Scots have been protagonists in the British Empire and all the horrors and wrongs that were done under the British Empire, including the Zionist project. It is no accident of history that Alfred Balfour was Scottish. Many Scottish soldiers served in Palestine, crushing Arab Palestinian resistance to colonisation and British imperialism. But of course there's also a radical tradition in Scotland from the workers' movements, progressive movements. The internationalist aspect of that we first seen in here and on the Spanish Peninsula, and the contribution Scottish people played to the international brigades trying to defeat fascism. It continued with solidarity with the Vietnamese people fighting American imperialism, the anti-apartheid movement, of course, in South Africa, and the movements in Latin America being crushed by American imperialism. And if we've also in Scotland got very good relations, the left and generally the Muslim community, from the Iraq, the disaster of the Iraq war. It's one of the silver linings in a very dark cloud, I think, where the progressive movements in the Muslim communities in Europe, certainly in our context, and I know in England also, have forged strong relations which continued through the attack on Lebanon in 2006, and really help the conditions in which we organise in terms of Palestine, particularly as the BDS movement has progressed. In this context, BDS in Scotland in general has been pretty successful, to the extent that we've been able to punch above our weight in a relatively short time. Of course, all the trade unions are now on board and actually actively implementing BDS, and particularly against the Israeli water company, Eden Springs. We've seen it being removed out of several universities due to BDS campaigns, and to the extent where this company has been complaining to the Scottish Government, saying that the boycott movement is harming their business. I'm the student coordinator for Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and I'll speak very briefly about the conditions of the activism in the universities. Of course, there were several student groups around Scotland when I took over the role, and meeting with the students in different universities and also in England, it was clear that there was a desire for autonomy within the student groups from external groups, whether it be Palestine, socialists, etc., etc. So I changed the strategy of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, actually having a society embedded in a university, and removed ourselves from universities to facilitate autonomous student groups who learn as they go their own activism and become strong partners eventually. The student groups have organised from 6 universities in Scotland over the last 3 years. Again, autonomously but coordinating nationally on weeks of activism, including the Right to Education week for the campaign from Benet, and of course Israeli Apartheid week. This time last year, as Hadar Adnan reached a successful conclusion to his brave hunger strike, it was on the back of Israeli Apartheid week, and Hannah Shalabi had emerged as the person who had been on hunger strike the longest, with several other prisoners behind her. So the students decided, we got together and we decided we would move into new territory, if you like, by calling demonstrations off campus, national demonstrations. This was the first time it happened. So very quickly over the next few weeks, as the hunger strike movement developed, we were able to intensify our actions and mobilise large numbers, particularly youth in Scotland, around the hunger strikes. From this, the students agreed to formalise the network under the name We Are All Hannah Shalabi. And since then, the relationship between the students and Scottish PSC with projects come up has been really stronger. The timing was good use of. We had towards the end of the summer that came after the hunger strikes, we had Bat Sheva, Israeli dance troupe, part of Brand Israel, funded by the Israeli state, performing in Scotland, and between the students and Scottish PSC we managed to get over 20 leading Scottish cultural figures supporting cultural BDS and supporting the protests that were carried out against Bat Sheva, including many disruptions, with very, very strong student participation. So the situation in general is pretty good in Scotland. Divestment is one area where we've not we're very much behind other places in the world. And to that end, we have a conference in October. Academic boycott is very much uncharted territory in Scotland. Perhaps for many of the reasons it's been discussed over today. There is some initial attempts to do academic boycott. Initiatives were very badly, targets were very badly picked. For instance, the British arms company BAE Systems, which pretty much runs the engineering department at Strathclyde University, as it does in England at Liverpool. It was rather untenable and impractical to approach this as a target. Just before I give an example from England that I'm aware of, I should mention the independence debate in Scotland, just because it is the political context over in Scotland just now. I can say that the independence debate and arguments from the left are very much pro-BDS, so this bodes well for us as we go forward. I just wanted to go back to some of the stuff that was said earlier, particularly around SAFED College in 48 and the racist decision by the Students' Association to de facto ban Palestinian students from representing or being represented. One of the things we did on this, we drafted a statement, and we got over 100 student leaders from across the UK, student presidents, vice presidents, etc., all the executive committee of the National Union of Students, and as a way of ending, I would like to just end with a suggestion that these kind of initiatives, these responses to these developments of attacks on Palestinian education, whether in 48 Gaza or in the occupied West Bank, or indeed attacks on the dissident Israeli academics that we discussed earlier, such as Ilan Pappé, Niamh Gordon. These kind of statements and collecting signatories, both amongst lecturing staff, trade unionists and student leaders, could be perhaps a way to help us collectively take academic boycott discourse to the wider student bodies and lecturing staff within our institutions. I would like to end there. Thank you.
Bueno, comentar que desde los colectivos internacionalistas organizados en Euskal Herria, la campaña BDS de alguna forma es considerada no como una herramienta más de solidaridad, sino como la herramienta de solidaridad, ¿no? La mayoría de nosotras en nuestros colectivos llevamos tiempo practicando la solidaridad política, no otros tipos de solidaridad a los que, bueno, pues de alguna forma, por supuesto, respetamos, pero que no hemos compartido históricamente sus objetivos, ¿no? Puesto que considerábamos que no iban a la raíz del problema. Con la campaña BDS, de alguna forma, consideramos que se concreta y se materializa esa idea de solidaridad, ¿no? Que nos aleja de la solidaridad caritativa que de alguna forma históricamente se ha llevado a cabo con el pueblo palestino. Para nosotras el BDS es una vuelta de tuerca en el concepto global de solidaridad, porque, por un lado, nos permite cambiar el foco de nuestra actuación. También históricamente, ¿no? Los movimientos solidarios han focalizado en Palestina. Hemos estudiado a fondo el pueblo palestino, su situación política, sus formas de resistencia, nos hemos atrevido incluso a juzgarlas. Y la campaña BDS de alguna forma cambia el foco, ¿no? Y creemos que eso es fundamental, cambiar el foco hacia Israel, ¿no? Hacia la parte ocupante, hacia la parte agresora, de la que en la mayoría de las ocasiones teníamos un gran desconocimiento, ¿no? Precisamente por un exceso de focalización en la víctima, también imbuidos, yo creo, por esa solidaridad que de alguna forma hemos mamado tan caritativa, ¿no? La consideramos una vuelta de tuerca más también porque de alguna forma es un paso adelante en el concepto de una solidaridad a un concepto de castigo, ¿no? Es muy fácil ser solidario, es muy fácil decir que estamos con la paz, de hecho a ver quién se atreve, ¿no?, a decir lo contrario. Y por lo tanto, de alguna forma, para nosotras es la persona que se une a la campaña BDS, de alguna forma ya está señalando al agresor y de alguna forma está exigiendo, ¿no? Es decir, pasamos de un concepto positivo, positivista, muy fácil de apoyar, a un concepto un poco más duro, ¿no? Con una mayor exigencia. Para nosotras supone también un cambio de dinámica. Por lo menos nosotras aquí creo que es extensivo a otros territorios. Hemos funcionado de una forma muy reactiva. Pasaba algo y entonces nos movilizábamos para protestar, dándonos siempre la sensación de que estábamos a remolque de lo que el sionismo llevara a cabo en un momento dado. La campaña BDS de alguna forma nos marca un cambio de estrategia, un cambio de dinámica, ¿no? Y nos hace convertirnos en unos actores proactivos, lo que para nosotras es absolutamente necesario, no estar a remolque ni depender de las cosas que ocurran, sino planificar con antelación una serie de estrategias que debemos seguir. Esto, desde luego, nos cuesta muchísimo, insisto, porque nuestra forma de funcionar bueno, ¿no?, pues ha sido otra más puntual. Esto nos lleva a la necesidad de planificar campañas a medio y largo plazo, por encima de las campañas a corto plazo, las que, si tenemos suficientes energías, les debemos dar respuesta, pero que si no, consideramos que no nos deben desviar de lo que es nuestra campaña o nuestro objetivo. En Euskal Herria, desde 2005, incluso antes de que la sociedad civil palestina sacara su declaración en julio de 2005, ya llevamos a cabo algún tipo de acción de boicot, y no fue en Bilbao como parecería, sino que fue en Iruña, una campaña que se lanzó contra NOA bajo el eslogan de No a NOA, haciendo un juego de palabras. Se ha focalizado mucho en el tema artístico, también porque parece ser que NOA tiene una especial predilección por Euskal Herria. Se ha focalizado en el tema deportivo, sobre todo con el Maccabi de Tel Aviv, con el resultado a día de hoy de dos castigos importantes a dos personas que saltaron al terreno de juego en diferentes partidos. Hemos trabajado también el boicot económico con Ájaba, con Veolia. Se consiguió también que en la municipalidad de Pamplona se rompiera el acuerdo con los autobuses municipales. Se han hecho campañas también en jugueterías. Y en el tema académico, la verdad es que nos encontramos con una problemática que yo creo también que compartimos con otros territorios. Es la falta de profesionales dentro de la academia o la falta de compromiso de profesionales dentro de la academia afines a la causa palestina o a la solidaridad internacionalista en general. Con el estudiantado es verdad que hay grupos muy activos como Kasle Bertxaleak, pero es verdad también que el alumnado, bueno, llega un año en que acaban sus estudios y se van, ¿no? Con lo cual es muy interesante porque son la parte, digamos, más activa, pero considero que crear un grupo de PDI, de PAS, ¿no?, profesionales dentro de las universidades es absolutamente necesario, ¿no?, que de alguna forma aglutine a todo ese estudiantado que vaya pasando con el paso de los años, pero que de alguna forma constituya el remanente, ¿no? para ese trabajo a medio y largo plazo. Es verdad también que aquí en Euskal Herria la propia situación sociopolítica condiciona en muchas ocasiones la agenda, ¿no? Por eso estos grupos que he mencionado, pues, como comentaba también John, pues bueno, ¿no? Están en muchos frentes, como nos pasa a la mayoría de nosotras, y pues en ocasiones tienes que priorizar, con lo cual es difícil, ¿no? Llevar todas las batallas a la vez, ¿no? Es un poco lo que nos comentaban nuestras compañeras palestinas cuando nos hablaban que su lucha no es una, sino que es una triple lucha, ¿no? Contra la opresión de la ocupación, contra el machismo, contra el avance de la religión, ¿no? Bueno, ¿no? Pues aquí de diferente forma, por supuesto, también estamos en muchas trincheras, con lo cual es difícil, ¿no? Estar a 100% en todas ellas. Aún y todo, consideramos que la universidad es un espacio absolutamente necesario. Llegar a las universidades, a la academia, es un espacio absolutamente fundamental, porque, como se ha comentado aquí, y se han dado claros ejemplos en las mesas de la mañana de forma muy clara y muy didáctica por todos los ponentes, la universidad es como el germen, ¿no? De lo que después van a ser los diferentes profesionales en medios de comunicación, en ingeniería, en física, en humanidades. Con lo cual, de alguna forma, es absolutamente necesario porque constituyen probablemente unos cimientos estructurales, ¿no? De lo que va a ser la sociedad. Nosotros nos encontramos con que la universidad o el espacio académico, que de alguna forma es como un submundo dentro de la sociedad, tiene también bastante carencia de un conocimiento de base y una concienciación, con lo cual nos parece fundamental trabajar el concepto BDS, trabajar, por supuesto, la solidaridad de base, sin la cual es muy difícil dar un segundo paso, y explicar qué es el BDS, ¿no? Cuando la gente empieza a escuchar, como nos ha pasado, por ejemplo, ayer en la Universidad Pública de Navarra, cuando la gente escucha que el BDS lo único que pretende es el cumplimiento de la legalidad internacional, bueno, pues la gente parece que va sintiendo un menor rechazo o un mayor acercamiento hacia esta herramienta. Porque algo que sí que hemos comprobado, yo creo que todas las personas que estamos en el mundo de la solidaridad, es el rechazo a la palabra boicot. La palabra boicot per se da miedo, asusta a la mayoría de la gente. Por eso creo que es muy importante también que vayamos desestructurando esas connotaciones negativas que de forma casi innata acompañan a este término. Para eso, nada más sencillo que contar a la gente cuáles hasta ahora han sido algunas de las principales adhesiones a la campaña de boicot, sanciones y desinversiones. Y cuando a la gente le explicas que, por ejemplo, en 2010, 26 exdirigentes de la Unión Europea, encabezados por el ex jefe de la diplomacia de la Unión Europea, Javier Solana, realizan un llamamiento al boicot de todos aquellos productos que vienen de las colonias, ya se quedan un poco sorprendidos. Cuando les comentas que también en 2010 Catherine Ashton declaró que la posición de la Unión Europea ante las colonias era clara, que era ilegal y que se debían aplicar sanciones al Estado de Israel, pues también la gente se sorprende. Cuando les contamos que diferentes cristianos palestinos lanzaron el informe Kairos en 2009 y que con posterioridad la Asamblea General de la Iglesia Presbiteriana y la Iglesia Metodista en junio de 2010 se adhirieron al documento y pidieron el boicot para todos los productos que vinieran de las colonias, pues bueno, ¿no? Parece que ya la gente empieza a parecerle que esta herramienta es menos peligrosa de lo que se podía suponer. Cuando además les leemos el documento de Desmond Tutu en 2012 y últimamente, como ha mencionado Tom, el de Stephen Hawking, la adhesión de Stephen Hawking en este mismo mes, pues bueno, de alguna forma creo que vamos ayudando a romper, ¿no? esa imaginería negativa y dañina que pueda tener la palabra boicot y que sobre todo nos encontramos también cuando, como ha sucedido estos días, hemos ido tanto al Parlamento Vasco como al Parlamento Navarro, ¿no? Que de entrada parece que les asusta, pero cuando empiezas a dar explicaciones y ya, claro, cuando les decimos que incluso Cristiano Ronaldo ha hecho unas declaraciones, ¿no? O supuestas declaraciones, pero desde luego ha hecho una acción de rechazo a, pues bueno, ¿no? Ya la gente es como decirle, a ver, si Cristiano Ronaldo ha sido capaz, ¿cómo no vais a ser capaces vosotros? Aun y todo, con esta, bueno, o en este momento, ¿no? Coyunturalmente difícil por lo que sucede en Euskal Herria, ¿no? Porque que necesita invertir o la inversión de muchas energías, y también lo que sucede en general con los movimientos solidarios, añadido a ello el momento de crisis global, etcétera, etcétera. En Euskal Herria se han llevado a cabo diferentes acciones, algunas de ellas exitosas, otras menos. Yo os voy a leer cuál es más o menos la situación en los diferentes herrialdes. El 14 de mayo de 2010, el Consejo de Estudiantes de la UPB aprobó un comunicado en el que se adherían al llamamiento de la PACBI y se llamaba a hacer un boicot general a las universidades israelíes. El 9 de julio de 2010, todos los sindicatos, creo que es algo que la verdad hemos explotado muy poco en el movimiento BDS, y los leo todos: ELA, Comisiones, LAB, UGT, SK, ST, IRU, N, CGT, LSB, USO y CNT se comprometen a denunciar públicamente a todas aquellas instituciones y empresas vascas que en su accionar antepongan intereses económicos, políticos o de otra índole a los derechos del pueblo palestino y colaboren o legitimen la ocupación colonial de Palestina. En febrero de 2012 se lanza un informe sobre el boicot académico en la UPB, y este informe viene motivado por la existencia, como se comentaba antes, la existencia de un acuerdo en el que la Universidad del País Vasco participaba junto con otras 10 universidades, empresas y centros de investigación en un proyecto denominado The Reactivity and Toxicity of Engineered Nanoparticles, Risks to the Environment and Human Health, NanoRetox, financiado en el 7º programa marco de la Comisión Europea. Y en este proyecto la UPB trabajaba codo con la empresa israelí Ahava, que, como ya sabemos y como se ha mencionado, está ubicada en la colonia de Mitzpechalem, en los territorios ocupados, y bueno, ¿no? Con todas las connotaciones que tiene. De este informe posteriormente salió una carta firmada por PDI, por PAS y por Estudiantado, en la que se instaba a la UPB a romper este acuerdo y, por extensión, a romper todo tipo de colaboración científica y académica con el Estado de Israel. En Gasteiz, Ikasle Abertzaleak, el grupo de estudiantado perteneciente a la izquierda abertzale, es el movimiento más implicado, pero bueno, pues como comentaba antes, sujeto también a la propia dinámica de las luchas en Euskal Herria, y por tanto falto todavía de una coordinación, de unos objetivos, de una determinada estrategia. En Navarra, hasta 2006, estuvimos en contacto con el Departamento de Ingeniería Agrícola, porque nos enteramos que tenían un convenio por el que todos los años traían a un profesor israelí y a un profesor palestino en esta política harto conocida de equidistancia y de pseudo-neutralidad. No sabemos si fue a raíz de los contactos que tuvimos con ellos, pero este acuerdo terminó. Y lo que sí persiste, que es un acuerdo de colaboración que empezaron en 2005 entre la UPNA, la Universidad Pública de Navarra, y ANAYAG en Nablus, la Universidad de Nablus, sobre molinos de viento.